ELI5 Why does the West like the US never got a military coup in their country? One thing that no one has mentioned is that in addition to peacefulness, prosperity, history, size, is that American citizens are armed to the teeth. I believe the number is approximately 2 guns for every person in the country. The American military is outgunned by the citizens. The only way a coup could occur is with the military destroying large portions of the country. Very few people would want to be in charge of a pile of ashes, and if there were enough citizen support for a military coup to be possible, the government would have already changed through the elections process. Despite some ups and downs and a general vibe of being displeased, the average citizen in my country never gets up from the couch to protest a and Y thing, because they're well enough off to not really bother. Additionally, all the usual factors of initiating a coup, military leaders for example, know full well, they'd be worse off if they didn't, that they're ill suited for actually leading this country. They might even feel loyal towards the Constitution and whatnot, but that's not as tangible. In short, the boat is moving forward and has no sizable holes, so nobody wants to rock it. The answer is the strength of institutions. X200b. I'll use the definition provided by economist Douglas North. X200b. Institutions are the rules of the game in a society, or, more formally, are the humanly devised constraints that shape human interaction. X200b. Institutions, not laws. The difference being laws when not backed by strong institutions aren't worth the paper they are printed on. X200b. Look at the 2021 insurrection, that could have very quickly turned into a coup if it happened in a country with weaker institutions than the US. The main reason is due to the general faith and trust in political institutions by the majority in power established by the Founding Fathers, who didn't seek to gather concentrate political power for themselves. The USA also had the benefit of building on established British institutional frameworks. While the US government does have its share of corruption, it isn't as overt or rampant as compared to some other countries. The USA did have its own civil war, which, while not the same as a military coup, did represent internal military and political conflict. A military coup is way easier when you have one person that holds a ton of centralized power. All you have to do is overthrow that person. In countries like the US, who would you even overthrow? If one was to capture the president, would that person be the new leader? Would you have to capture every congressperson? Every Supreme Court judge? Would each state government recognize this new military dictator? It's obviously not impossible by any means. See Jan 6, 2021, but it's another factor in why you see fewer coups in countries like the US. There's an old joke which answers your question. The USA hasn't experienced a military coup because there's no US embassy in Washington, D.C. Explanation: very frequently those military coups are encouraged, organized, backed by the USA. This was the case in Greece, in 1967. The CIA had an active role in the military junta which ruled Greece until 1974. Since then, we commemorate the overturning of the junta with a big march towards the US Embassy every year, on November 17th. Often, it depends on where the most value in society economy comes from. If your society is a majority of natural resource extraction, it's easy for armed groups to take the centers of the economy under control. If people resist, you can take him out and find new peasants to replace him. Whereas if the value come from the productivity of your citizens, like you can replace a doctor or engineer easily, in essence trying to take over a free and open economy will destroy the very value you seek to take control of. Adding something that others have not mentioned: watch CP Gray's YouTube videos on coups, highly recommend. Once you have one coup, it becomes far more likely to have another. The new dictator promises money to their loyalists, and all it takes is a new person, usually one of the loyalists, to offer others more money to overthrow the first dictator. The citizens also have little loyalty for the dictator and don't mind a second coup as much. So basically, having that first coup opens the door to more bread and circuses. More free entertainment than can possibly be consumed by a single person, meat that's cheap enough for everyone to afford. If you have a medical emergency, our hospitals have to treat you even if you have no insurance and no way to pay, you'll go into debt, but you will be alive, etc. The people, largely speaking, have our basic needs met well enough that they'd generally rather stick with what we have instead of risk our lives fighting in a coup. Material conditions matter. 10 coups? You have your answer then. Essentially, your country has a culture where coups are permissible and seen as the way out. The US, outside of the Civil War, does not have this culture. Americans do not see it as acceptable nor the way out or forward. That really is it in a nutshell. That is also why setting new precedent is dangerous. You open doors you cannot close. Not by the forces of nature or laws of physics, but by mere human psychology alone. What country had more than 10 successful coups in the past 10 years? Edit: I looked up a source. You are making this up for some reason. Are you American Western and just trying to get an answer by imagining a fictional counterexample? It's very weird that you think any country had 10 coups in 10 years. The military, and most of the federal government are apolitical by law, and are also under the Commander-in-Chief and Chief Executive respectively, aka the President of the United States. Anyone within the military if found out to be plotting against could face jail time or the death penalty. Most higher-ups would be more loyal to the president than your average Joe infantryman that may want to plot against the government. As a U.S. military officer, we swear oath to defend the Constitution, not to obey the president but to support and defend the Constitution. Even if we got a president who went nuts and tried to order us to consolidate their power, we would have the moral obligation to refute such an order. There's no dogmatic centralization of power within the US military the same way some countries swear fealty to their figurehead. Certain political factions in the US might believe they have the ability to challenge the US military, but that's nonsense. The US military is by far the strongest the world has ever seen. They might try to destabilize a nation in various ways, but even the ex-president trying to overthrow an election didn't even remotely come close. While it is possible, this is one of the least likely countries for it to occur. Democracies do not tend to put all their power into one individual. Take the UK for example. Our Prime Minister has the most power in any individual within the UK, but to get laws etc. put into action they have to be voted in Parliament and then signed off by our House of Lords. So having a coup is very difficult because none has enough power to take control from in the first place. The standard of living is high. Coups, revolutions, and other dramatic departures from the political norm work because the instability is worth the risk compared to continuing to deal with whatever issues a country is currently ailing from. Trump's coup attempt for example probably wouldn't have made it nearly as far if it wasn't coming off the back of the pandemic. The US military members take an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. This means that they can disobey an unlawful order if that order would be to be part of a coup. This in the tradition that the military takes orders from the civilian leadership has been a strong brake on any urge towards a coup. Coups typically only occur in economically politically unstable countries where the government is largely failing in some way. Western democracies are generally stable despite how it may seem. The internal political disagreement between parties' citizens is not so bad that either side feels the need for an armed rebellion takeover. Even if someone did try, it would have to be a very big and heavily armed group since it is a huge country and a huge federal military with each state having its own military as well. Gather materials and manpower would also prove very difficult since the NSA would likely quickly pick up on all this before anything crazy happened. Beyond the most recent attempt in the US Jan 6, there was an attempt at a coup in the 1930s. It was in fact stopped due to the military being apolitica. The 30s had a lot of catalysts too. So without the general who stopped it there likely could have been one. Having read so many responses, I have a question of my own. Why is it then that the West is much more politically and economically stable than the rest of the world? The first answer that comes to mind is colonialism, but were Europeans the only colonizers? Or were they just perhaps the first most effective? A military coup requires large numbers of young men to feel risking their lives in armed conflict is the easiest way to improve their circumstances. Western countries are very good at convincing young men that there are less dangerous and less socially destructive ways to improve their circumstances because of a general trust in the institutions and that everyone is the equal before the law. No one person can use a position in the government to gain unjust power or benefits, i.e. corruption. This leads to political stability and a prospering economy and thus removing any incentives for a coup. 1. Civilian control of the military. The military answers to and is commanded by the elected president. 2. The military recruits from the whole of the citizenry, not just a caste of warrior elite. 3. Rule of law grounded in a constitution and enforced by courts and judges. Western countries also have much stronger democracies with regular elections. When people are upset about the current government, it's easy in the West to organize a campaign and vote against the government. So all that negative energy just goes to the system. No offense, but American assassin presidents have been lone gunmen but with cliques of business and government and fraternity. If we had a coup, And why was the security for Washington, D.C. BLM had increased security over that of January 6, 2020? One thing not mentioned so far for the US military is that one of the reasons our rotations began was to stop anyone from consolidating too much power in a region. Generally every 3-4 years military members rotate to a new location. The US military is also larger than many countries. The scale required to stage a coup makes it nearly impossible. It would be stopped well before even a fraction of the people required to pull it off were recruited. Among the many reasons, the US military is very big on being apolitical. It's very well ingrained in military culture. You can get in serious trouble for campaigning for a candidate while wearing a uniform. Other comments have gotten into the US, but I'd read up on the history of South and Central America before you say no country in the West has had a military coup. In fact, the US had supposed several. So you are pretty much saying that an oath, which is pretty much a statement, is sufficient to prevent a coup? I mean, probably every country around the world has some shape or form of an oath. This might start off a massive debate. Boo-oo-oo. Australia is a Western country which was couped in 1975. 1930s era Western Europe would like a word. Also there are periodic, rather pathetic but still unnerving attempts from time to time. Recently in France and Germany for example. One reason is how seriously US military members take the idea that they are here to obey lawful orders and are subordinate to civilian authority. It is a deep-seated belief. Plenty of military coups are funded by the US. We're not going to fund one against ourselves. Well, one president tried it recently, but that's not normal. Was asked and answered about 3 weeks ago.